As you know, this program is set aside for you to ask your questions, give your comments on any topic whatsoever. And as my role as host of this program, I will endeavor to answer your questions to the best of my ability using our Catholic faith, our scripture, the tradition, the saints, the popes, the fathers, the councils, and just about anything I can find to answer your questions so that you walk away confident that I have answered your question. We meet here each week on Tuesdays and Wednesdays at 8 p.m. and going to 9:30 p.m., sometimes a little over. And as you know, we also changed our format a little, although we still have questions. We cover a specific topic, sometimes two topics now, which is what we're going to do tonight at the beginning of the program. And then I'll hopefully leave time for questions that you have on those topics or any topic that you want to ask a question about. So feel free not to be bogged down by the topics we cover. You can ask any question you'd like. And I am way behind in my email questions, as somebody sent an email from Australia today to remind me that I haven't answered their question, and I don't even know if I'm going to get to it tonight. But I think every once in a while I'm going to have to set aside a time I can answer all my email questions that come in. Some of them rise to the surface, however, as we have noticed yesterday and last week, because certain topics have come up that need attention right away, and I will endeavor to do that. Sometimes these things have a short shelf life, so to speak, because the news cycle is on a 24-hour basis, and if you don't get to it soon, you're going to lose the prime time that it needs to be addressed. So with that, let me begin our program by going over something that we covered last night. Someone had asked a question about what it means for what it means when Jesus says turn the other cheek in Matthew chapter 5 in the Sermon on the Mount. And I gave what you would call the traditional answer to that, which was, this is a certain context in which Jesus is teaching us not to retaliate. And as a matter of fact, taking a blow on the cheek or anywhere on your body, I mean, it doesn't have to be your cheek. It could be your head, your shoulder, your stomach, your chest, whatever. Somebody could push you around. And so the question is, what would you do if somebody starts pushing you around? Do you retaliate? Well, the traditional answer there, too, of course, is that if your life is threatened, and you believe it is, then you have every right to defend yourself. Okay, but that's not what Jesus is talking about in this particular context. He's talking about personal relations with people and what is to be our attitude as a Christian. Are we to walk around with swords and guns and nightsticks or whatever to, clobber the first person that gets in our way? Or are we to be, very cautious about when and if we retaliate? And that's basically the message he's trying to teach us there, as I tried to make clear last night. I was led by this email to a video that Michael Voris had put out regarding his interpretation. And I don't think it's actually his. I've heard this interpretation before, where he says on his video, in a context where he's fighting the liberals of the Catholic Church, and rightly so. And, as I said about Taylor Marshall last night, I have every respect in the world for Michael Voris. So what I'm about to say in critique of his interpretation is no reflection at all on Michael Voris. Michael Voris, in my opinion, is one of our top Catholic, I don't know what you would call Michael these days. I mean, he's just a bulldog. But I'm not going to say Catholic bulldog. I wish there was some professional term I could put on it, but he's much more than a Catholic apologist. And we probably need to look at that term a little bit Catholic apologist, because I think it's being shoved in a direction that may not fit all the time. And, we're more like Catholic warriors today because of the things that confront us, that we do have to go out there and fight, spiritually speaking, mentally speaking. And so an apologist, in contemporary terms, is someone who defends the position of his authority, and or his employer or whatever. And his job is to make sure that there are no rumors started by false statements, and he basically has to clear up what people are saying, because a lot of it is filled with rumors and falsehoods. So that's his job, to make sure people have the truth about what his leader was really saying. And in the Greek sense, the word apologia is where we get the word apologetics. It means just that, that we're here to defend someone who may be misunderstood by others. And some of those others have a vested interest in distorting what is said so that they can make the person look bad. And it's the apologist's job to straighten all those things out. Be that as it may, Michael gave us an interpretation of the passage in Matthew 5 about turning the other cheek. And I've heard this interpretation before. It sounds very clever, and but I haven't seen any sources on it. I just heard it repeated time and time again by certain people who maybe don't like the context of Matthew 5 and are trying to find another way to explain it to justify their particular method of fighting who they think they need to fight. And that interpretation says, in so many words, if someone, they take the passage quite literally, and it says, let me get the Greek out, because I just want to make sure I get all the I's dotted and T's crossed here. And again, that's Matthew chapter 5. Excuse me, I didn't have it ready for you. Well, I had the English ready, but I didn't go to the Greek. But so for my excuses. All right. All right, so here it is, Matthew 5:39. It says, "But I say unto you that you do not resist evil, but whoever shall smite thee on the right cheek, turn to him the other also." So what they try to do here is they say, well, let's focus on the word right, because he's pinpointing the right cheek. And he certainly is. In the Greek, it is the word root is dexia, which is the right. And they say that means that if they smack you on the right cheek and you offer them your other cheek, okay, so here's my right cheek. So if someone, slapped me on the right cheek and I turned to him my left cheek, well, that means they have to use the palm of their other hand now and smite you on the other side. And I think that's correct. I haven't actually worked this out, but I'm just taking their words for what they say. And if someone strikes you on the palm, with the palm, that means that they're asserting your equality with them, somehow raises you up instead of humbles you. And So we wouldn't want to do that. So Jesus is using right cheek basically in a play on words where it doesn't mean what we think it means, although the obvious meaning of it is that if someone strikes you, you say, okay, well, strike me again, because you're not going to retaliate. It's just a way of saying, look, I don't know what your problem is. You don't like me for some reason or whatever the case may be. I'm not going to retaliate. I want to find out what the deal is here. What did you strike me for? Okay. And Michael gave the example of Jesus being struck when he was tortured by the Roman soldiers. And it says they struck him, and instead of, and Jesus says back to them, I've told you the truth. Why do you strike me? And Mr. Voris is trying to make a contrast between what our normal interpretation of turn the other cheek is, as opposed to what Jesus did. Now, I don't see that. I see Jesus doing exactly what he prescribed in Matthew 5, which is he didn't retaliate. Of course, he's probably in no condition to retaliate, but he would say exactly what you would want someone to say who's been struck or pushed or whatever, where the other person's trying to start a fight with you and you're not going to engage. And you're not going to engage because you don't know what the deal is. Okay. Why are you striking me? And that's basically what Jesus did. He says, instead of giving any epithet back to them or warning them, you're hitting the Son of God or anything like that, he just says, what, if I told you the truth, why are you striking me? Which would be a normal question. If somebody struck me on the cheek, slapped me across the face, I control myself, have enough reserve to figure out what's the deal. Okay, why did you hit me? And if you have a good reason, in your own mind, okay, let's talk about it. If you don't have a good reason and you want to show that you're in full control of yourself, you're not going to engage in some kind of fist battle here because nobody even knows what you're fighting about, and certainly you don't. You turn the other cheek and say, I'm not, basically you're giving a sign. I'm not going to retaliate. You want to sit down and talk about this? Let's talk about it. Okay. That's the attitude that we should have as Christians. Not walking around with a club or a gun or a sword, waiting to chop the next guy's head off who gives us a hard time. That, of course, is not what Jesus is teaching. So now I made one qualification of that, and that is when you sense that it's actually more than a blow on the cheek. This man intends on hurting you to the point possibly of death. You may not be alone. Your family may be with you, and he's letting you know that he's going to rob you, rape you, kill you, whatever. And so now it's in a totally different context. Now you have the right and freedom to protect yourself and your family. And if you don't do it, then you're being irresponsible. But that's a totally different context, okay? And so I think this interpretation that's flying around, where if he actually slapped you on the other cheek, he'd be elevating you to some status that puts you above him or equal to him or whatever. I don't know where that's coming from. I really don't. Okay. There may be some Jewish midrash or commentary that implies something like that. If there is, I haven't seen it. And I can guarantee you, if there's anything close to it, it has its own context. Okay. Because for the Jews at the time of this passage, Jesus is teaching them the opposite of what their interpretation was of the Mosaic law. If you read the rest of the context, it bears this out. And let me just read a few more verses so that we can get the context of what Jesus is saying here. And the first context starts in the previous verse. Actually, it says, "You have heard that it was said, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person." And then he talks about them being struck on the cheek. Okay, so here you have the first indication that they used to be teaching an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but that's not going to be the case anymore. Okay, we have the new covenant that's going to try to show love and not one of immediate retaliation to anyone who attacks us. Okay. So he's making a contrast between what they used to do in the Old Testament and what he wants them to do now. And then he goes on and basically enhances this whole attitude that we're supposed to have. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Okay. Why? Well, we're basically telling the world, look, we're not going to retaliate. We're going to go the extra mile for you. And hopefully by that, you'll see that we mean you no harm. We want to do good, not evil. We want to be friends with you. As Paul says, be at peace with all men in Romans 13. This is the attitude. Now, sometimes it doesn't work. Okay. All right. So then we have a different situation. They're going to continue to attack us. Okay. Now we go into mode 2. Now where our life is actually being threatened. And as I said before, that's a totally different context. Jesus here is just talking about what is our attitude as a Christian? How do we react? Do we react the way the world reacts? Where, like you're on the highway and you hit somebody with your car and they get out in a road rage and point a gun in your face because you hit their car? Is that what our attitude is supposed to be? No, not as a Christian. Okay, the world does that, but not us. And then he goes on and he says, "Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you." Again, what does the world do? Yeah, it's going to be a hard job for you to get, a couple dollars out of the world, because, we're all in this as individuals, and we have to rugged individualism. We have to fight our way, cloth and tooth and nail and you name it. And, nobody's going to get a free lunch. That's the attitude of the world. You see, not for the Christian. Somebody asks you and you can sense that they mean what they say. They're actually in the destitute situation. You give to them. Okay. Same thing James says in James chapter 2. You see a man naked and without food, what do? Do you walk on by and say, "Be warmed and be filled," or do you help the man? That's the Christian attitude. You help the man. Okay. So you see the context Jesus is building here. And then he goes on in verse 43, "You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be the sons of your Father in heaven." So on and so on. And as a matter of fact, at the end he says, "And if you greet only your brothers, what are you doing more than others? Do not even the pagans do that?" You see? So he's comparing the world's attitude to what we're supposed to have. And there's also another passage talks about, when you're being persecuted, pray for those who persecute you. That's the Christian attitude. Okay. So you see that the context has nothing to do with, whether he hits you on the right cheek or the left cheek. So that if you give him your other cheek and he slaps you there, he's actually putting himself in a precarious situation because he's raised your esteem up. No, that's not the context of the passage. The context of the passage is for the Christian to have a very humble attitude. a very meek attitude, like Moses was meek. And that's why God chose him as the leader. And I think Michael's concern was that, Christians read this and they automatically think they have to be doormats. That's the exact word he used when I listened to his video. And no, that's not what Jesus is teaching here. Okay? That's a whole other context. We are not doormats. We are as bold can be when we go out and preach the gospel. And we tell these people, you're doing wrong by committing abortion. You're doing wrong by your fornication. You're doing wrong by contraception. We tell them that. And those words hurt. And we tell them that, and we know we may be persecuted, but we go out and tell them anyway. Okay, so in that kind of frame, in that kind of perspective, a Christian doesn't need to be shy at all. As a matter of fact, when he gets struck on the cheek here, he can turn around and say, brother, what do you have against me? What's bothering you today? That you took it out on me, you don't even know me. Okay, have a conversation with him. And then as I said before, if he still intends on physically harming you, then you can defend yourself. Okay. But here we're talking about what's the attitude, what's the general attitude of the Christian. And we can't wash it away by saying, well, he used the right cheek instead of just the word cheek. And so that means that, there's this dynamic going on that, we may be uplifted instead of humbled. It's not in the context, I can tell you that. And I don't know of any authoritative source. And if some Jewish source has something other, that's not the authority we're going to use to interpret the New Testament. I guarantee you that. So I just wanted to clear up that matter, and I hope you understand. Luffy says, if they slap, we got to body slam the attacker. No, Luffy. That's the last resort. Okay, so now, and we are going to get to our main topic today, which was about, how to get to heaven. So Lawrence, you can relax. And I think the title we have is Faith or Faith Alone. Or what is it? Faith Alone, or is that correct, or something like that? I forget the exact title we had for our program tonight. But these are things I have to clear up. And I promised yesterday that I was going to clear up this issue about what the Pope said a couple days ago concerning 2 Corinthians 5:21. And that's the passage, if you remember from last night, where it says, he made himself to be sin for us. Okay. And the problem with this passage has been a perennial problem. Okay. Not just with this generation, but the father struggled a little bit, the medieval struggled a little bit with it, but they all came to a consensus about what the passage is saying. And it doesn't mean that Jesus became sinful, okay, that he himself became sinful and God judged him for that sin on the cross, and thereby he paid the punishment for our sin, because somehow he became the sin that we have in us. He became that sin in bodily form, and God punished that body as if it was full of sin. And thereby Jesus pays the punishment for us, and we can go to heaven because, see, he paid the price. You've heard that expression before, which is another expression that's taken out of context. And where they end up is saying, like Martin Luther and John Calvin, changed the whole dynamic of the atonement, because they took this passage to mean that Christ's body actually was filled with sin, and God punished it, vicariously on the cross, and thereby Christ paid the punishment for our sin, and we can all go to heaven. Well, of course, for Luther and Calvin, that meant the elect So Christ just paid the price for the elect by having himself full of sin and being punished for it, and the rest of the world, you're out of luck. Christ didn't pay for your sin, so you can never go to heaven. Yeah, so you can see why the church in the Counter-Reformation reacted against this whole idea of Luther and Calvin, which stemmed, by the way, from their idea of absolute predestination, which was the first thing that Luther got excommunicated for in 1520. Absolute predestination is by the word absolute, meaning that God chooses some to be saved and chooses some to be damned without regard at all to free will, of which we have none, says Martin Luther. We are just picked or not picked from the beginning of eternity, and he gives no rationale for the criteria God uses to do that, and which is problematic in itself. And as a matter of fact, he wrote a book called The Bondage of the Will in 1525, reinforcing his heresy. And that's where it all started. And if you believe that kind of atonement theory, then basically when you come to a passage like 2 Corinthians 5:21, where it says he made himself to be sin for us, yeah, the natural way to look at that is salvation is a legal matter. Okay, that's what they both believe. Salvation is a legal matter. And to be adjudicated from that sin, well, God substitutes someone for us who is as sinful as we were, because he accumulates all the sins of the elect into his own body, and God punishes that in one stroke. And that's the way we get our salvation paid for, because it's a legal process. There you have the legal sin, and you have a legal adjudication to that, and now you have a legal atonement. And that's all there is to it, you see. So that's the origination of the passage. And now what I want to do is read to you, which I had promised before last night, a little bit of the commentary that I have. So this is an advertisement for the new commentary that's coming out. And this is on page 176 of the Bible commentary. Okay. He has made sin for us. I'm talking about Christ. Uper emon armentian epision. The Greek being rather abrupt, similar to verse 17's grammar, wherein Paul makes the object and the verb switch places. And it actually reads in the Greek, him who knew no sin, sin he made. The first leg of the Greek clause is understood. Christ needed to be a pure, spotless sacrifice without any state of sin, a pure state of being which allowed him to offer himself to God on behalf of all sinners. Obviously, God would not make, and that's from the Greek, a poison, Christ a sinner in the ontological sense. In fact, God cannot make anyone a sinner, least of all his only Son. Although it is proper to say, as Scripture does, the Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all, from Isaiah 53, verse 6 and 11, or who his own self bore our sins in his body upon the tree, as in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 24, or being made a curse for us, as in Galatians chapter 3, verse 13. These passages do not mean Christ became sin or a sinner or took upon himself our guilt for sin, so that one could conclude Christ was judged for sin instead of us. The complete judgment for sin is both physical and spiritual death, as taught in Romans 5:12, John 10:28, Apocalypse 20, verses 10 to 15. Although Christ suffered the former, that is physical death, he did not suffer the latter, that's spiritual death. Even the physical suffering he underwent was not a partial punishment for our sin. He suffered physical death since God was anticipating the ultimate sacrifice from a man, from which he would be appeased for the sins of the world, and thus give the world a pathway back to himself. It was not a punishment to adjudicate and thus absolve the sins of the world. If Christ had paid the price for the sins of the whole world, everyone in the world would be saved. But they are not, as Scripture plainly teaches. In other words, God cannot place man in double jeopardy. Once the price of sin is paid, it cannot be charged and paid again. Hence, in the clause, he was made sin for us, Paul means, as he himself states many times in his epistles, that Christ took upon himself the sins of the world in that he became a sacrifice for sin. And that's taught by Augustine and the other fathers and medievals. Not that he was offered as a punishment for sin. In Greek, the words, he was made sin for us, excuse me while I scroll up here, is a shorthand way of saying he was made a sin sacrifice for us. We see the same shorthand in, for example, Hebrews 10, verses 6 to 8, in which the phrase kai peri hamartias, which translates into English, and concerning sins, means and concerning sacrifice for sins, if you look at the context of the passage. In the same way, in the statement of 1 Peter 2, verse 24, that Christ, quote, bore our sins in his body on the tree, unquote, the word bore translates the aorist indicative naken from anaphero, which is used 10 times in the New Testament, which is a term used in offering sacrifice. It is also used in 1 Peter 2, verse 5 for Christian sacrifices, where it says, quote, a holy priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices, unquote. And the same in Hebrews 7:27, quote, to offer up sacrifice, unquote. And Hebrews 13:15, quote, let us offer the sacrifice of praise, unquote. And James 2:21, when it says, quote, when he offered up Isaac, unquote. Also in the Septuagint of Leviticus 14:20, I won't read the Greek, but translated into English, it says, even atonement for their sin. So tying in bore with offering, another Greek lexicon notes that anaphero means Christ was once for all offered up in this respect, that he took upon himself the sins of many. Quoting from Hebrews 9:28, quote, so Christ was once offered to bear the sins of many, unquote. I'm going to scroll down again. The Greek lexicon also cites the use of anaphero in 1 Clement 16:14, which says, and he bare the sins of many, and for their sins was he delivered up, unquote. In other words, Christ was offered as a sacrifice on account of the sins of many, which allows 1 Peter 2:24 to be understood as, quote, who offered for our sins his body upon the tree, unquote. Not that Christ became sin in his body. As Cornelius Lapide puts it, the meaning is that God made Christ to be the victim offered for our sin when he says he made him to be sin for us. He employs a metonymy according to Canon 3 of interpretation. So with Ambrose, Theophylact, and Anselm, Scripture frequently speaks of an expiatory victim as sin, as in Hosea 4, verse 8, where it says, they, the priest, shall eat the sins. And what it means is the sacrifice offered for their sins of the people. Not that they actually eat sin, okay? Or in Leviticus 4:24, it says, well, there's a Hebrew here, because it is a sacrifice for sin, and thus the Vulgate translates it. This is all from Cornelius Lapide, and you can find that on his commentary on 1st and 2nd Corinthians, page 473. So I know I said a lot there that probably the only thing that's going to shine through for you here is that all these fathers, medievals, and the scripture passages never say Christ became sin in the ontological sense. Okay? That's never said in scripture at all. All the passages that relate to 2 Corinthians 5:21, and I think I've named about a dozen of them, all are talking about Christ becoming the sin sacrifice. Okay? So big difference between becoming sin and becoming a sin sacrifice. Matter of fact, what we'll need to stress on this, of course, is the fact that if Christ was sinful ontologically in his body, he could never be a sacrifice, because the sacrifice required that the victim of the death that was going to occur be a pure, undefiled, sinless victim. Otherwise, he could not offer himself as a sacrifice. This is exactly why we needed Christ to come, to be the sacrifice, because all other men were sinful, and therefore they could not be the ultimate superior sacrifice that God was looking for from man. So a man had to come who was totally sinless, and so that he could offer himself as the sacrifice to God to appease God's wrath. And then what's important to know is that by appeasing God's wrath, it didn't mean everybody was automatically going to be saved. All it meant was, in our Catholic theology, is that God reopened the door to salvation that was closed by Adam when he sinned. And now we all have a decision to make. Since God reopened the door, what's the decision going to be? Yes or no? And that's where our free will comes in, which is the very free will that Luther and Calvin denied that we had. So you can see how totally different our respective theologies are between Catholics and Protestants. And most Protestants today are following either Luther and Calvin in full or in part on their theories of the atonement. And I go through some of them in my commentary to show you where they're all coming from. And some very contemporary Protestants are holding that. And most of them believe, that Christ paid for my sins. And that's, in the legal sense, because their whole idea of atonement became forensic when Luther changed the rules, basically. So, as I said, that's where the problem starts. All right, so that all related to the fact that our Pope had said a couple days ago or last week, whatever it was, that Christ contaminated himself. And he quoted 2 Corinthians 5:21. Well, he just became a Protestant because that's what they believe, okay, not Catholics. And, when I said, look, the Pope's not a theologian. He is an administrator, a people pusher, a spokesman, but he doesn't know his theology. Okay. He says things off the cuff like that he hasn't really studied, and he's not a disciplined kind of theological mind. Okay. So we have to expect these things from him. More are coming, believe me. Okay. He comes out with maybe one every, week or 2 weeks, and be prepared. They're coming. But just take it all with a grain of salt. Okay. He just, as I said, we have 57 different varieties of popes. Some are very theologically astute, like Pius X, for example. Some are very culturally moved and ideologically moved, and they're very what do you just say? They're talking about love and peace all the time, and things like this. Not that they're wrong, but they don't know the other side of the fence too well. Okay, the theological, metaphysical, exegetical world that most of the deep thinkers of the Catholic Church reside, and some of them need to learn love and peace. Believe me, yeah, that's very true, because we can sometimes have so much head knowledge that we don't know what love is anymore. We define it, but whether we live it or not, that's another story. And this is the problem with a lot of theologians. Okay, we can lose sight of the real truth of the Christian faith. It's not in a book. Although we get it from a book, it's not, as if we have to go look up what we're supposed to do. We know what to do as Christians. We give love, and love to God, love to our neighbor, the two basic commandments Jesus taught us. That's not hard to do. It's not hard to understand. And a lot of what Francis preaches is that, very simple. And he says a lot of good things along those lines, where, we get so uppity about our religion, and, we have to be orthodox, and, yeah, that's all good and well. But, when you forget to feed the poor, or feed the hungry and give to the poor, and, your Christianity is limited to book knowledge instead of real practical living, you got a problem, big problem. Not only in our day, in much of church history, we find the same problem. So that message from him is very well taken, and I appreciate that whenever I hear it. But of course, he's weak on the other side, as I said. So be prepared. Things like this are going to come. All right. So tonight we were going to talk about faith and works and faith alone and all that stuff. And we just hit on some of that in covering the atonement. But basically, where I like to start with this whole thing is Romans chapter 4, which is the very passage that Luther and Calvin had tried to use to condemn Catholicism, is the very passage I find to be our strongest asset. So I don't think it's any coincidence that Romans 4 is the basic passage that surfaces to the top of the discussion whenever this topic comes up. And if you've ever read my book, Not by Faith Alone, which I wrote, 25 years ago this year, published by Queenship Publishing. We also have the second edition. Queenship carries the first edition. You can get that at robertsongenis.org. Just 775 pages. That's all it is. You can read that in a weekend. But if you don't want to tackle that one, you can get the, which is basically the abridged version of Not by Faith Alone, and that is How Can I Get to Heaven? And that's also sold at robertsongenis.org. So if you want the full details of what I'm going to tell you in the next, 15 minutes, you can get those books, and you will not regret it. And the Not by Faith Alone book, that's now 25 years old, it's very well endorsed by a lot of Catholics in the country, and it's got a nihil obstat and an imprimatur. So, and what else can I say about it? It's written in very easy prose. It's not deep theological language. The footnotes in the book, they get pretty deep. Okay, and you got to know the languages, Hebrew and Greek, sometimes in order to read those footnotes and know what they're saying. But that's for the scholars. This Not by Faith Alone book, I had designed it to be like bifocal, where on the top of the lens you can see clearly long distances, but on the bottom you can see the fine print, and you see the details, the specifics, so to speak. So a lot of the scholars like the footnotes because it explains a lot of the prose that are right above, and the prose are written on a Reader's Digest level. Anybody can understand the prose of the book. And I wrote it just that way for lay people, okay? But since it was such a controversial topic between Catholics and Protestants, and has been for, 450 years, I had to get into some details, because the scholar will read the prose and go, yeah, ho-hum. What about this Greek word here? Did you look at that one up? Okay, and so, as a matter of fact, I did look up one of those words that the Protestants kept on using, where they say they translate a Greek word as imputed. I'm sure you've heard of that term. Imputed means that you are assigned something. It's imputed to you, and it sort of it fits in with their forensic theology. There's a special definition to the word impute. Anyway, they have been using this word it's in the King James Bible, for Pete's sake. And it translates the Greek word logizomai. And their idea was that you are imputed with Christ's righteousness. It's not your own. It's imputed to you. Okay, that's where the definition of impute comes from. And such that you're still a sinner, but someone has given to you his righteousness that covers over your sinfulness, so that when God looks at you, he just sees the covering, the righteousness covering that was imputed to you. But underneath, you're still a sinner. Now, St. Robert Bellarmine, called that fiction. That you can't have someone else's righteousness that God looks at when underneath of that you're still this dirty, rotten sinner. And he was right. And so I went to look up this Greek word logizomai in the lexicon, and I think it's used about 15 times, maybe if I remember correctly. And I'm looking for the definition that the Protestants had put on this word, which was that when something's imputed to you or logizomized, let's say that way, it's not yours, it's from somebody else. And so it's when somebody looks at it, they're not seeing reality. They're seeing something that's different than reality. They're seeing something that they're not seeing the reality of your sin, because they're looking at the covering of Christ, you see. And I'm asking myself, is that the way the word logizomai is used in the Greek, in the Koine Greek? Okay. And I looked up all the passages in the New Testament for logizomai, and not once did it talk about logizomai referring to something that does not exist, that only exists in your mind. But it refers to something that actually exists. Okay? So if that's the case, then if God actually is looking at the reality, then he's going to see the sin, because that's the reality. Okay? And that's why Bellarmine called the Protestant understanding of this a fiction. It is a fiction. And yet they're trying to say that this word imputed comes from logizomai, and logizomai means this, and no, it doesn't at all. And you'll find that in the footnotes of Not by Faith Alone. But in the prose, you'll find something that deals with, let's say, in Romans 4, it says, now let me read it, just make sure we get the right words here. Because you know what? All you really need to know is this passage. Everything else is just detail. And I can teach you this passage in the next 15 minutes, and you'll have everything you need to know. Plus a little bit more that I'm going to add in there that it's going to wow you. All right, so Romans 4. Here's one key concept you need to understand. Once you understand this concept, the whole thing will be easy. Okay, starting in verse 1. What then shall we say that Abraham, our forefather, discovered in this matter? If in fact Abraham was justified by works, he had something to boast about, but not before God. What does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Okay, now the word credited, it's the word logizomai. And I just told you about logizomai. But the Protestants love to use the word credited. They love to use credited because that just goes coincides with their idea that salvation is a legal matter. If someone just put a credit in your book, you didn't deserve it, but they put a credit in your legal book, your accounting book, and God looks at the accounting book and sees that there's a credit there. Okay? But if we're going to use the word logizomai the way it's always used in the Koine Greek, it means that it wasn't just a credit, you were actually righteous. Yeah, imagine that. And that's why God gave you justification, because you were actually righteous to receive it. And that's what the Catholic concept is. That when we're baptized, it's not just a symbol, it actually is the means of grace whereby the Holy Spirit cleanses our soul so that now it appears before God as righteous. Not appears, it is. You have a righteous soul when you're baptized, and God's looking at that. See? So that's why the word logizomai is there, because God's actually seeing righteousness. Okay? Protestants don't like that concept, because Luther said, no, we're still this ball of dung covered by snow. It may look pure, but underneath of it all is just this ball of dung. The Catholic Church said, no way. The guy says we're justified. That means we actually are righteous before him. Okay? So let's move on. Now, when a man works, his wages are not credited to him as a gift, but as an obligation. And I'm reading from the New International Version because that's the version they use. Okay, now let's look at this. Let me read it again. Now, when a man works, his wages are not credited to him as a gift, but as an obligation. What does that mean? If you don't understand this passage, you will never understand Catholic justification, and you won't even understand Protestant justification. This is the key passage right here. And it's so easy to understand. He's saying that if a man works, then what is credited to him is a debt. In other words, if he works, he's owed something. Okay? It's not a gift that you're going to give him because he works. Okay? That's the normal understanding of works. If I work, I am legally in the position where I expect a payment for my work. When I say legally, that makes all the difference in the world. Okay? Here's how we know that. If I am legally owed money for my work, and that man doesn't give it to me, then I can take him to a legal court of law, and I can sue him, as long as I have proof that I worked. I punch my time card. Here it is, Judge. I worked from such and such and such and such. That means this man owes me the amount he agreed to pay me in the contract I signed when I took this job. Okay? That's legal. And the judge will make a legal decision, and he will force that employer to pay you the amount of money he owed. Now you can sue for damages and all kinds of things like that, but we're not going to get into that. Okay? So that's what it means. If someone works, he's owed money. He's owed a payment, whatever you want to give him a cow or a horse or land or whatever, or money, whatever it is, you're going to owe him whatever you agreed to pay him. Okay? And what Paul is saying with Abraham is that, look, God never agreed to a contract wherein he pays you for work done. Never going to be that way. Okay? And that's why Paul, at the end of Romans 11, he says, verse 36, I think it is, God owes no man anything. Okay. So that's the difference. That's why Abraham can't go up to God and say, hey, I did this work, you owe me. Because God owes nothing to no one. You could never put God in a position where you say, God, I'm going to do this work, and I want you to sign on this dotted line here. It says you're going to pay me for my work. God says, sorry, chum. That's not the kind of relationship I want. I want nothing legal. Okay? If there's something legal there, that's just to sort of keep everything in line, like the law was supposed to do. Okay? But that's not the kind of relationship I want with you. What do I want? I want a personal relationship with you. I made you in my image. And I want you to love me for who I am. I want you to share my vision for the universe. I want you to be as holy as you possibly can be, because any sin is going to damage our relationship that we have. That's what I want. Okay? That's the kind of God I am. I don't want someone who's just said, I don't really care about you, but, if I do this work, I want to be paid for what I do. And if you don't pay me, then, I'm going to sue you. Yeah, you try to come to God that way, forget about it. Okay, that ain't going to happen. So then Paul goes on to say, but then there's this thing called the gift. Where does the gift come from? A gift is something that anyone can give to anyone without expecting any kind of payback. If I give you a birthday gift, I don't expect any kind of payback from you. I'm just giving you a gift because it's your birthday. Okay? A gift is something that a benefactor like God, who has all the gifts, can give to someone for, let's say, work that he did. God can say, look, we're not going to be on a tit for tat, quid pro quo basis wherein you work and I give you exactly what you deserve for your work. If I give you something for your work, it's going to be a gift. Okay? That's the kind of relationship I want. I'm the benefactor with the gift. You can do all kinds of works and please me, and I still don't owe you anything. Okay? Because we don't have that kind of relationship. We don't have a contract. What we have is a personal relationship. And in that relationship, you can do all kinds of work, and I'll give you, as a matter of fact, I'll give you more than you actually would deserve if I paid you on an obligatory basis. If you get paid, you work for a certain company and you get paid $15 an hour, that's it. That's the limit. They're not going to give you 16 or 17 or 18 or 50 or 100, because that's not what the contract says. The contract says they pay you $15 an hour. Okay, that's what you signed off on. So you can work double time, triple time. It doesn't make any difference. You go by what the contract says. Okay, so they're not obligated to pay you anything more. But God says, you know what? If you work for me, I'll give you much more than what your contract would have given you. I'm going to give you heaven itself and the right to live with me for the rest of eternity in total bliss, with no problems, no worries, no crying, no tears, no nothing. Nothing to worry about ever. That's far and above the $15 an hour you're going to be paid to work for an employer. Okay? And why can God do that? Because it's based on his benevolence, just on the fact of who he is. And that's why he wants them to trust him. Trust me. I'm telling you the truth. I'm going to give you this for the work that you do. And this is why Catholics can say that God justifies us by our works, because he's not paying us tit for tat. If he did that, we would have ended up in hell. Okay? We do our works and God gives us way above what our works deserve because we're not on a contract basis. Okay? Now, that's the concept you need to understand. All right? And so when Paul is using the word work here in Romans 4, he's talking about works like he does with the Jews in Romans 9. You know, their mistake was they did their works. They could care less about God. You know, you can tell because, you know, they worshiped the golden calf, the first thing they did when they came out of Egypt. So they didn't really, you know, care about him per se. But man, they wanted to do their work and they wanted to get paid for it. You know, they wanted their food that day. So God gave them their food. But that's as far as their thinking went. Okay? And that's not the kind of relationship God wants. Okay? So they're using work in the legal sense. And that's what Paul is doing here. If you try to do legal works to force God to pay you something for those works, like I said, forget about it. That's not going to happen. Okay? And that's what Paul's teaching here. So, not a very hard concept to understand. You just have to understand works in, you know, in the legal sense, or works because I want to work for you because I love you and because you're honest and benevolent, you give me whatever you think. And I know it's going to be way above what I think I would be owed if I worked for it in a legal sense, you see. So you understand there's two different concepts of works, and the argument's over. It's over. Okay? Then you can get to all these little details like logizomai, you know, how's that used? And it just fills in all the gaps, believe me. There's one more thing I want you to know here. And this is the one I think that will wow you. Not that the other one hasn't wowed you. I mean, men have been fighting about this passage for centuries. And I've hardly met two people who understand what's being said here. And they all go off on their tangents. And they all try to proof text their way to their conclusion. And they don't understand the basic argument that Paul's giving in Romans 4. This is a Catholic passage. Okay? And I'm going to show you why it's even more Catholic when we deal with the next guy that Paul deals with here, and that's David. Now, you all know the story about David, King David. Man of God from when he was a little child. You know, was the only one in Israel who stood up and fought Goliath. He was the only one of his 7 other brothers that Samuel brought forth that were brought forth to Samuel, and each one that were older than David and had the right to be king before David, each one, Samuel says, let him pass through. He's not the one. And then comes to David, and he says, this is the man God has chosen. And to explain the fact that his 7 brothers didn't get chosen, Samuel says, God looks at the heart and not the outside. That's why David was chosen. So this lad was good from day one, even though he says himself in Psalm 51, I was born in sin. Okay? But yeah, we all are. So we have to live with that. But besides that, David was a supreme character in the Old Testament. Example par excellence of how, read the Psalms and see how he was attacked by his enemies because he held to obeying God. But then came this time where he got tempted, looking out over his roof, and he saw Bathsheba taking a bath. You know, the next thing we know, David's fornicating with her and sends her husband to the front lines to be killed so that he doesn't have to put up with him. And he got her pregnant, and they had the baby, and God took the baby's life. And David's life was never the same afterwards. He was chased until the day he died. And his wives were raped. And that was all due to God's judgment upon him for his sin. Okay? So Paul is talking about that period in David's life here, the time that he sinned. And this is what David says, or he says about David. Now, when a man works, oh, we already read that. All right. However, to the man who does not work, but trusts God, who justifies the wicked. Now, when we say do not work, what we're saying here is he works, but he doesn't put God in a position of being obligated to pay him anything, because he knows God owes him nothing. And that if he gets anything, it's from God's benevolence. That's what Paul is saying here. So, the man who does not work, but trusts God, who justifies the wicked, his faith is credited as righteousness. And there's that word logizomai again. You see how important that word is here, how many times it's being used in this context. And then he says in verse 6, David says the same thing. In other words, the same thing as Paul is saying, when he speaks of the blessedness of the man to whom God credits righteousness, there's the logizomai again, apart from his works. Quoting David now, when David said in Psalm 51, blessed are they, or Psalm 32, both Psalms cover this. Blessed are they whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man whose sin the Lord will never count against him. Okay, so now I had read this passage probably 100 times, even when I was a Protestant. And I read it, and I did everything to this passage except the correct thing, which was to understand that David is being used as an example of someone who has sinned, has repented of that sin, and not thrust, works in God's face. See how good I am, God. He repented of his sin, and God forgave him of it. And I had applied it to everybody else in the world except David. But David is the one that's being used as the example. Once you see that, and some of you may be saying, well, what's so hard to see about that? That's a good question. Depends on where your mind is, okay? Because your mind brings all this kind of baggage to the passage and doesn't let the passage speak for itself. That's why, okay? So, at any rate, it's David. So if that's the case, or not if, since that is the case, that David himself is being used as an example of Paul's teaching on justification. All right. What does that mean in Catholic terms? Well, we already went through the life of David. I told you, he stood up and conquered the Philistines by killing Goliath. He was the man of his brothers, who all his brothers were passed up, and David was chosen. Why? Because God looks at the heart of man when he makes his decision, not the outside, not what he portrays to people. Okay, we know that about David. David wrote the Psalms. Just honest to goodness love of God in each of those Psalms, praying to God to help him in all his endeavors. I mean, you couldn't find a holier man than David. Okay? But then David sinned. And David sinned a mortal sin. So what was David before he committed his mortal sin? Was he justified before God? Was he a justified man? Well, it'd be hard pressed to say no, wouldn't we? I mean, here's a man par excellence of holiness and faith and righteousness that God himself extols whenever God talks about David. Because he says, and David did all these good things, and he messed up in one area. That's the way God regards David in the Chronicles. Okay, so obviously David was a justified man before he committed adultery with Bathsheba and murdered her husband, Uriah. Okay, so then how can David be used as an example of justification if, as the Protestants say, you're only justified once when you accept Jesus Christ by faith? So how can David then be used as an example? Because in David's case, he apparently lost his justification when he committed adultery and murder. And now Paul is saying that David was justified after he repented of his sins of adultery and murder. So that means David was once justified, lost his justification, and then regained his justification. Brother, that's Catholic. Okay? Nobody else teaches that but the Catholic Church. Give you an example. Someone out there commits murder and adultery. And he goes, and he was baptized as a Catholic. He was justified. He had all the rights and privileges of a Christian. Living as a Catholic, we would say he's justified. But then he commits these heinous sins, murder and adultery. He goes to the confessional. After he comes to his senses, goes to the confessional, confesses his sins of murder and adultery, and he's absolved of his sins by the priest. And so now what happens? Well, he's rejustified. He gains his justification back from when he lost it, when he committed those mortal sins. That's what happens all the time in justification or in the Catholic confessional. Whenever we have mortal sin, we can confess it to the priest. He will absolve us, and the eternal guilt of that sin is taken away. Now, it doesn't mean the temporary guilt's taken away. Okay? I mean, he gives you penance, but still, you're going to be subject to God's punishment on this earth or in purgatory, one or the other, for what you did. You can be forgiven in the eternal sense, where that sin is absolved eternally, but the temporal punishment, just like David had to go through. As I said, his life was never the same. God chased him place to place, and he had no rest until the day he died. Okay? Same with someone who's going to commit murder. These are heinous sins. You're going to be punished. Okay? That temporary punishment is going to be given to you, and but the eternal guilt is going to be taken away. Okay? That's exactly what happened to David in Romans 4. Okay? So there's no way you can fit David into Romans 4 if you're a Protestant, because if you're a Protestant, you only believe David's justified once, and then he can't lose his justification. At least that's what Luther and Calvin taught. Okay, now they have variations of that, of course, in Protestantism, because even the Protestants saw the flaws of that. Okay, and so they'll agree that, yeah, David lost his justification because you can lose your salvation, and you need to get it back. Yeah, well, they just came back to the Catholic Church, if they say that. Okay, well, I'm talking about the original Protestant reformers. All believed that, you could never lose your justification because you're eternally decided. It's decided eternally that some of you are going to be saved, some of you are going to be damned, and there's no free will about it. Okay, so they could never fit this passage into their theology. Now, the way they try to do it, and this is the answer most of the Protestants I have confronted with this, and I'm talking about guys like James White, Eric Svensson, who's no longer around, and a couple others, and they'll say, well, he's not talking about David. He's just using David to refer to everybody else. Of course, when I hear that, then I know I'm on the right track. Because obviously, if Paul is using David as an example of a sinner who gets his justification once he repents of his sin, no, he's talking about David. Of course, it applies to everybody else, but it applies to David first. And in 20 years that I have, 25 now, because I had given James White this interpretation of Romans 4 concerning David in our debate on justification back in 1997, 98, something like that. Could have been before. Long time ago. And I've never gotten a straight answer yet from him or anybody else. I confronted who's the guy, the president of Westminster Seminary out in California? Michael, he's still the president out there. And I confronted with this argument to him at least 3 times. He even had me write an article about it in his Reformation magazine, probably about, 10 to 15 years ago. And I've never gotten an answer from him. You know, is David the example Paul's using for a person who gets his justification when he repents of his sin? They just won't answer the question. Okay. So remember this. Okay. You got 2 whammies here. You got the whole thing about works, how to understand that. And now you got David being the example par excellence of Catholic theology. Okay. Of baptism and confession. And then after that, you close the book and you say, would you please explain those to me? And don't go proof texting. I want you to look at the context and I want you to give me an alternate interpretation that makes sense. And that's better than the one I just gave you. And they won't be able to do it. Okay. I've been at this too long and I've never seen anybody answer the question. So, and that's 26 years since I've actually, gave that interpretation. So, as I said, it's very simple, and the rest is detail. And you can get all the details you want in Not by Faith Alone, the book I wrote 20 some odd years ago at robertsongenis.org. We have it in paperback and hardback. So, all right. So let me so Shamuian, gosh, I wish you guys would use a name I could pronounce. I haven't seen you, he says. God willing, I will go live and show a flaw in what Sungenis is saying here in order to prepare a rebuttal. Well, I'm glad you're thinking about it, Shamuian. Good luck, because if you do come up with an interpretation that trumps mine, you're going to be the first one in 25 years that's done so. And I'm not trying to pat myself on the back or get proud here at all. That's the last thing on my mind. My quest here is for the truth. I mean, you guys keep pounding us Catholics for saying, oh, you Catholics, you think you get to heaven by your works. First of all, you don't understand what we mean by works, as I've just demonstrated with my whole excursus there on Abraham. And second of all, you can't explain why Paul's using David as an example of a person who's justified when he was already justified before. Okay, so that kind of, upsets me that you guys keep using the same worn out arguments day in and day out. And you I won't say anymore. All right, let me go up to the top here. Sorry, I only have about 10 minutes left. So, okay, so I'm trying to go through these as fast as I can here. A close friend of mine has a godfather and a godmother for one of her kids that lent someone money for an abortion, and they do not repent of it. Are they disqualified from being godparents? I would say so, yes. All right. Comment. Joe Moreau says, your opening presentation against Dr. White in the justification debate is the best presentation on the Catholic position in modern apologetics, bar none. I love the CEO worker analogy. Yes, that's very good, Joe. I didn't use that. Let me just say that because I was going to say it, but I forgot. Let me just give you this. Let's say you work for IBM and you sign a contract. I will work 40 hours and per week, and you will pay me $1,000. Okay. So every week you come in, you work 40 hours, they pay you $1,000. This goes on. You just got hired, and you come in and you show yourself a worthy employee. You come in every week, and you do your good work, and they pay you $1,000. Okay. And after about a year or two, they notice what a good worker you are, and the boss comes up to you and says, "Hey, Joe, admire your good work here. Glad you're our employee. Say, I'm moving my family into the next town because we found a better house for a growing family. And would you come over and help us move my furniture? I'm getting some of the boys from the office come over, and instead of paying a mover, and would you come over, take part in the festivities and help us move the furniture?" And you say, "Sure, boss, I will gladly do that." And so he says, "All right, come over this Saturday, and we'll start working right away, and hopefully we can get done by the end of the day." So you come over on Saturday, and you're moving his furniture, and man, you're huffing and puffing and sweating, and you're getting tired, and so the end of the day comes, and the boss says, "Hey, Joe, thanks so much for coming over and taking part and helping us get this stuff to the next house." And you say, "Yeah, no problem. Glad to do it for you." And he says, "By the way, the guys are going to get together and go out to the pub and have a couple of beers and, get to know each other. And would you like to come along after, we dump the furniture off and, have some rest and relaxation, blah, blah, blah." "Sure, yeah, I'll be glad to go." So after you move the furniture, you all go out to the pub and you have your beers and you're joking around, having a good old time, and get to know the boss, you see, on a personal level instead of just on a work level. And that's good for you. Okay. So the boss comes up to you and says, "Joe, I've been thinking about this for a while. And, after I've seen you work so hard and I've seen you come over voluntarily to move the furniture, I want to move you up in our business to take this job that is like 3 levels above where you are now. Because you know why? I think you deserve it, and I think that you will do a good job. And I basically want to reward you for excellent work and being an excellent person. So next week when you come into work, don't go to your regular place. Come to this, room 333, and there will be your new job. And I'll have somebody train you, and you're going to make 3 times as much money as you did before. And just my way of thanking you for being the person that you are. Okay. So you see the difference there? There's one thing called a contract where Joe works for 40 hours, gets $1,000 and goes home. Doesn't know anybody, doesn't kibitz with anybody, doesn't really know the boss at all. The boss is watching though. Okay. And now he wants to strike up a better relationship with Joe because he wants to keep Joe around a while. Someday Joe may be the president of the company. Who knows? So he strikes up a personal relationship with Joe. Joe comes over, moves his furniture, meets his wife, kids, goes for a dip in the pool, goes to the pub. How much more personal can you get? Okay. And he gets to know his boss. And now his boss, he doesn't owe him anything. He doesn't owe him anything for being a good guy. He doesn't owe him anything for helping to move his furniture because Joe did it all voluntarily. But he is going to give him one of the greatest gifts Joe has ever received, and that is a promotion that's going to give him 3 times the salary he had before. Wow. All because the boss liked Joe and wanted to strike up a personal relationship with him. Okay. Because the boss wouldn't take over any old Joe. He's going to take a good Joe and move him up. You say, so out of the benevolence of the CEO, he's going to give Joe these opportunities that he's never had before. all because he has a personal relationship with him, you see. That's the difference in the kind of work that we're talking about. There's one work that gets paid $1,000 for 40 hours of work. There's another work you do where you're going to get much more than what you would have got paid for working 40 hours. You're going to get all the congeniality, the love, the concern of your CEO that you would have never gotten just working 40 hours for $1,000 a week. Okay, you have a whole totally different relationship. Now, you will work, but he's giving you more than you would have ever thought possible with the little Joe that you were walking around that new place. Okay, so that's the main difference. That's a great analogy. Thanks, Joe, for reminding me of that. I hope you don't mind I used your name, Joe, throughout that whole analogy. All right, Supueda, I still don't know your first name. Dr. Sungenis, did you know that you are mentioned in the Wikipedia article, Faith Alone? If you look under the Catholic view and then under biblical exegesis, you will see yourself exegeting James. And I wish they would do Romans. That would be a better one. The James one's pretty good too. Maybe we should do that one sometime, because I just tear that thing apart and put it back together. And that's another reason why you want to get the book, Not by Faith Alone. Yeah, first you have to go through the whole context of James, all 5 chapters, and then you draw a smaller circle, and then you're looking at chapter 2, and then you look at a smaller circle, and you're looking at verses 21 to 24. And that's the way to attack it. So, well, thank you for that. I didn't know it was there. All right. Kevin Keene, God be praised. I was looking for a copy of Not by Faith Alone just last night. Came up short on that search, by the way. Well, Kevin, now you know where you can get it. Hardback or soft cover. All right. Arnold Wayne, have you read any of N.T. Wright's works? If so, what are your thoughts on his view of justification? They're Protestant. And he goes off on this whole, covenant thing. The answer is not in the covenant. There's the old covenant and then there's a new covenant. And, a lot of these modern scholars go off on this, and I cover this in the book, what they do. They're trying to make it an ethnic issue between Jews and Gentiles. It's not an ethnic issue, okay? It's a theological issue, and it has been since the Council of Trent started to see the problems in Protestant theology 400 years ago, okay? For some Catholics, the Council of Trent's not enough. They want to go off into this idea that was started by a couple of Protestants. What are their names? I used to rattle these names off the top of my head. Now that I'm getting older, I forget a lot of names. But it's in the book. It's in what? Chapter 9, I believe, toward the end. And that's where N.T. Wright's coming from. So right away, they got the wrong paradigm that they're using to go in and analyze this issue of justification. Okay, because if you're not going to call it a theological issue, you're going to go off on tangents that are not relevant. On some levels, yeah, we could see there's a little ethnic thing between Jew and Gentile, but that's not the basis of the issue of justification. They're just tangential things that sometime you got to deal with out in the periphery, but not the kernel of the truth, okay? And so I cover that issue in the book. So I don't know if I name N.T. Wright specifically, but I name all his mentors that started that particular theology. Okay. There you go, Lawrence. Nice salesman that you are. I'm interested in religious art and its meaning. Do you have a good book on analyzing paintings and works of art? I just happen to have one. Funny that you ask, Arnold. Lawrence, would you be so kind as to give him the link to go find that book that's on our website that I wrote myself. It was actually a major paper that I was writing when I was in seminary many years ago, and then I enhanced it and then made a book out of it because I find it invaluable when you're looking at art to know what you're looking at. You know, when you see Picasso drawing a woman that looks like a chair, why is he doing that? Okay, that would be one of the basic questions I would ask. You know, whereas all the Rembrandts, the Raphaels, they're all painting as if you can almost take. It's almost like a photograph, not quite, but it's almost there. So what are they trying to say to you? And what was Michelangelo trying to say when he stuffed all his figures, looked like they weighed 300 pounds, up in the Sistine Chapel? There's a philosophical reason for all that, okay? And that's what you will see, at least in the major artists, okay? We're talking about the big boys. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, Rembrandt, and then your modernists, Picasso, Mondrian, all those big names. Not so much the, lower echelon painters. They just sometimes painted to paint. But a lot of these bigger boys had philosophical messages in their paintings. And that's what the Christian needs to know. He needs to know where these guys are coming from in order to give them the Catholic apologetic. That's not the place where you want to be, and give them the reasons for it. But first you have to decipher what they're saying to you, okay? So yeah, that book is available on our website. What's it called? Gosh, I forget the title. What is the title? I just forget it right now. Lawrence will lead you to it, won't you, Lawrence? And there's a new message at the bottom. Maybe that's Lawrence. No. Okay, so Lawrence, find him the link, would you, to that book? You know which one it is. The philosophical meaning of great works of art, medieval to modern. That's the name of the book. And Lawrence has just given you the link to that. Down, so scroll down there, Arnold, and you can find it. Okay. Where was I? I'm going overtime tonight, just a little, because I have some energy left. Happy Ash Wednesday to you, Katie. Looking for the question. Okay, Zachary says, like to hear your thoughts on the fact that there were many in the church who saw left-handedness as of the devil, which led to abuses. How do you know about it? How does it reflect on the church? Not very well. I mean, that was even the case when I was going to grade school. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't so prevalent then, but I noticed it here and there. And wow, that just, there's a lot of superstition in the Catholic Church. Okay, I'll have to admit that. And this stuff just hangs around and hangs around. And yeah, it's bothersome. So that was one of them. And I'm glad we reached a point where that's no longer the case. But yeah, not everything in the Catholic Church is going to be hunky-dory, okay? You're going to have things like that and worse that are, part of the business, as we say. All right. Lawrence, you're such a jokester. He says, I found a copy of Hogan's Christ's Redemptive Sacrifice. The cover looks pretty hippie to me. You sure this guy is legit? Lawrence, have you never heard your teacher tell you never to judge a book by its cover? What's the matter with you? Luther said the groundwork for forensic justification, trying to contact a scheme that would divorce by faith Paul from works, when James never mentioned works of the law. Yeah, and that's a good point too, because Paul will say in Romans, he'll use works of the law, but in the Greek, if he says works of law without the article before works, he's talking about the general notion of works. If he said, if he puts the article before works, he means the Mosaic law. Okay, still works, but it's a smaller circle of works, and he uses both terms. Sometimes they use both terms in the same context, and you have to be able to decipher them. Okay, and you'll find that in my commentary in Romans. I point that out in the new commentary. So when Paul is referring to general works, the principle of works, I work, you pay, as opposed to the Mosaic law, okay, which is important to know in various contexts. Okay. R.C. Sproul talks about imputed righteousness where sins past, present, and future are imputed to Christ. But St. John in 1 John disagrees in that we, includes himself, confess in order to be forgiven. Yeah, I'm not quite getting the comparison between 1 John and R.C. Sproul. Because, Sproul believes that if you confess, that you, in order to be forgiven, you confess. So I'm not sure what the distinction is you're trying to make here. Yeah, but R.C. Sproul was one of those, oh boy. And we asked him to debate twice, and he refused twice. Maybe he didn't think I was a big enough name or something. He didn't want to waste his time. I don't know. But we asked him to debate because he kept pushing this idea. He died, about 5 years ago or more. And yeah, he thought he knew it all. And we could never crack into his ministry to try to set the record straight. So before he died. All right. Frequency in the New Testament, 40 morphology of biblical Greek tags. Gloss to credit, count, reckon, regard, think, consider. Yeah, the problem with, I know Bill Mounce. I know him very well. He does know his Greek. He has a Greek course he teaches on the internet. We were even going to move up there once, a long, long time ago, up to Washington, where he lives. His father was my pastor when I was a Protestant in California. So I got to know the family pretty well. The problem is Bill Mounce never looked up the passages of the New Testament that use the words logizomai and looked at the context and then determined what the word meant. He just takes the Greek lexical meaning that's invariably written by Protestant scholars who've never been confronted with the idea that logizomai means that what you're seeing is the reality and not something that's just counted as a reality. Okay. As a matter of fact, I just gave that argument to a professor of mine, Dr. Poitras from Westminster Theological Seminary, probably 3 months ago, and I haven't heard from him since. So, yeah, this is all new to them. And I remember one of the first questions somebody asked me when I became a Catholic was, well, what do you do with the Greek word logizomai? And at that time, I didn't know the answer. No, actually, no, I did know the answer because I had written Not by Faith Alone by then. So I was ready for his question. I never knew anyone would even ask the question because, you know, the definition and use of logizomai is just buried under mountains of books that nobody pays attention to. And then he goes, wow, no one ever taught me that. When I went to Protestant seminary, he says. And yeah, I said, so there you go. Now you can imagine what more hasn't been taught to you. If they can't even get the word logizomai correct, you know, what are they going to do with all these other concepts? Has anybody ever told you that David is a perfect example of Catholic justification in Romans 4? Because he was once justified, then lost it, and then regained it when he confessed his sin? Nobody's ever told you that. And we've read that passages how many times? Thousands of times without seeing that truth. You see? So, yeah, there's a lot there that you have been told about what Catholics believe and how you should interpret the scriptures and all this kind of stuff until you see the other side of the story. Okay? That's why we're here. Okay? So, question from Joe. First question, Dr. Sungenis. You rock. Is that a question, Joe? Second, what are your thoughts on using the miracle of the sun at Fatima as proof for God's existence against an atheist? You try it, Joe. Depends on who you're dealing with. You know, I mean, if I were an atheist, I would say, next. I just wouldn't believe it. I just say it's all myth and legend and fantasy, and people make up all kinds of things. Okay, they have hallucinations, you know, stuff like that. Yeah, I don't think that's going to do it. So now what I would do is, you know, I would take them. First thing I would take, I'd say to the atheist, you want to get serious about this? All right, I'll get serious about it. Okay, we're going to take a trip to France, and we're going to go to Lourdes, and we're going to see where Saint Bernadette is entombed in a glass case, and she looks as fresh as the day she was 30 years old. And this has been over 150 years she's been dead. That's the first thing I do. And then I take them down to Italy, and I would show them the places where the bread of the Eucharist actually, well, you know, what we understand as bread, actually turned into the actual flesh of Christ and has a blood type of what is it, AB? And anywhere that these Eucharistic miracles occur, the blood type's always AB. And it's always of the heart muscle. Okay. Those are the first couple of things I take him to if he was really serious. Okay. And then once you get him to start looking at things from possibly, maybe I don't know everything, you know, there's something more to it, then I might start talking to him theologically. Okay. And say, now, do you want to start reading the Bible? See what that, because that's where all this stuff comes from. You want to do that? I'll help you exegete it. And, you know, so you take them step by step. Thank you, Lawrence, for putting logizomai up there. Of course, it's the infinitive form, logizotai, but thank you so much. Dr. Robert, I have a question. Why don't Protestants go to purgatory during near-death experiences? They all seem to go directly to heaven. What does that tell you? It's all fake. Yeah, I mean, you can give a natural explanation of why they have these. They've been thinking about this stuff all their life, okay? It's inbred in their conscious and in their subconscious. They dream about this at night, okay? So if you're having a near-death experience, yeah, in your subconscious state, okay, we can understand why those things are going to occur. And who's going to want to go to purgatory or hell? Okay, so that would be my answer. What is this? One guy, they had a movie made about a child. I think it has heaven in the title. About some child who went to heaven, came back to earth, and started talking about what he saw in heaven. And I saw so many contradictions in what was written about what was reported that he saw in heaven that I was almost going to write a book about it and just show step by step how this whole thing is just made up. But I never did get around to it. I got too many things to do and never did get around to it. But it's I forget. Maybe Lawrence knows what it was. Yeah, I just can't remember right now what the title of the book was, but that's along the same lines, okay? Very good, Roseanne. Thank you for that. I just watched your debate with the atheist Reformation. You made mincemeat for him. Of him, you mean, not for him. Atheist Reformation? Was I on that? I don't think you mean atheist Reformation. I think you mean something else Reformation. Because that's the show that Michael Horton, that's his name. Michael Horton, who is the president of Westminster Theological Seminary in California, Escondido, was the guy who I said I presented this argument about David at least 3 times in an article, and he's never responded to it. And I presented it to him on the phone when we were talking, and he's never responded to it. So, but I think you mean something. I know they call it something Reformation. They used to have a radio program called the same thing. So I think that's what you're talking about. All right. With Drew on the atheist reference. Okay, now it's ringing a bell. I remember that name, Drew. Yeah, Michael Horton. That was the guy's name. All right. Okay. So it looks like just a lot of statements here. All right. So now you're going to let me go. Lawrence says it's time to triple his salary. Okay, Lawrence, you're right. Okay, so 0 times 3 is what? All right. Okay. So I'm going to go now. All right. So it's been very nice to be here with you again. We went over time for 20 minutes. So who owes me out there? 20 minutes. Just kidding. All right. So we wrapped up this week, and we will be here again next Tuesday. And that is what? The 23rd of February. And we will have a new topic at that time, and my good friend Jonathan will post it somewhere, and we'll take it a day at a time. We'll have 2 new topics next week, and then all your questions, and I got through a pretty good amount of them here tonight. And thank you for all your attention, and please don't forget to visit robertsongenis.org, and possibly if you can press our donation button and help us to keep going, that would be much appreciated. All your gifts are tax deductible, and we have a 20% discount on all our materials running at least this week and maybe next week. So take advantage of it, and you can get a good price on Not by Faith Alone right now with that 20% discount. So there you go. All right, folks, we'll see you next week. God bless you all.